Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be doing some practice with the banks and the bank balance sheets that we learned in the last video. So this is just a series of bank balance sheets questions. Now, what I'll kind of preface this by saying is that most of these are actually AP problems where I've kind of taken chunks of them as we go along. So you're doing some AP exam practice problems while we do this. So the first question says, show how a $1,000 checkable deposit would be listed in a T account if the bank is under a 10% required reserve and it loans the rest out. So, it's basically write out, like, what would you see, if we see this stuff down here, what would we see up here under that circumstance? So it says that there's a $1,000 checkable deposit. So that's what we call a demand deposit. So we know that someone walked in and deposited $1,000. And so we put 1,000 right there. Now on this side, on the assets side, it got turned into something. And it tells us that they're under a 10% required reserve. So we already know that the required reserve is 10% of 1,000. So that's 100. Right? But now we've got to make the two sides balance because it's a balance sheet. And it actually tells us they loan the rest of the deposit out. So the rest of this 1,000 turned into loans. And so that's in the amount of 900. And that's all we've got to do. Now let's take a look at the Bank of Ladue. They have the following balance sheet, blah, 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 blah. Required excess, loans, bonds, demand deposit. Okay, so it's everything that we kind of expected to see here. Nothing kind of out of the ordinary, savings accounts, checking accounts, and so forth. What is the reserve requirement? So we know that that's the ratio of two things. It's the required reserves to the demand deposits. So we're going to look and see required reserves is 10,000, demand deposits is 50,000. So it's 0.2, right? 1/5 is 0.2. So you can write that as 0.2, or you could write it as 20%. Either one's fine. Assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Ladue Bank. Then it asks, how much do the total reserves, excess reserves, what's the effect on the M1 measure of money supply? This is where things get hard really fast. So just be careful with this one. And I would actually encourage you to use the T account in front of you and kind of edit it as you're doing this. So if Louise withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Ladue Bank, we know that the demand deposits are going to go to 45,000, right? Because he took out $5,000. Now, that doesn't help us with the reserve side, but it does help us kind of understand what's going to happen over here. We know that the reserve requirement is 20%, and we know that he took out $5,000 in cash. So there's a couple of things that we know are true. So we know that the total amount of reserves, if we added these together, is 15,000. Total is 15. Well, after he withdraws 5,000, what's going to happen to the total amount of reserves? Well, they go down by 5. So now they're at $10,000. So these two numbers are going to both decrease. But what students often immediately do is they say, well, they just take it out of the excess reserves. That's not correct. Because remember, the bank's under a 20% reserve requirement. So how much of this 45,000 does the bank have to keep in reserve? Well, they have to keep 20% of it, which is 9,000. So the amount that they have to keep over here now is 9,000. So that went from 10 to 9. That's down by 1. And we know that the total had to go down by 5. So the other $4,000 that went to Luis when we withdrew the money came out of the excess. But it's not all 5. It's just 4,000 of it, and it's left with $1,000. Now, if this is hard for you to kind of wrap your mind around, go back and look through my work and see what I've done here. 9 plus 10, or plus 1, is 10,000. That's the total amount that we're going to be left with in reserves, because Louise took out $5,000 and we went from 15 to 10. But remember, the reason why this isn't 10 and 0 is because this 50,000 was telling us how much had to be in required reserves. So actually, we kind of can think about how much does the total reserves change by, and then allocate that change in which part is required, which part is excess. So by how much do Bank of Ladue's total reserves change? Well, we know they total change by $5,000 because he withdrew the money. But the excess reserves do not change by 5,000. They only change by 4,000, again, because we no longer have to hold as much money in the required reserves. Now, this last question really throws students off. What's the initial effect of this withdrawal on the M1 measure of money supply? And remember that he took it out of his checking account and he just put it into cash. So if we can kind of remember for a moment that we've got this thing called M0, And we've got this thing called M1 that is, that M0 plus demand deposits. And we basically moved money from demand deposits over to the M0 side. But the total amount of the M1 didn't change because the M0 got a little bigger and the demand deposits got a little smaller, but the total amount didn't change. Very tricky. Be careful on those. The Bank of Clayton has the following balance sheet, and there's lots of these practice ones, so hopefully the tricky stuff will kind of work out as we go through these. Required excess loans, bonds, property, stuff that we kind of expect, demand deposits, savings accounts, owner's equity. Okay, again, stuff that we expect to see. We kind of note already, though, that this bank is already running right at the bare minimum. They have no excess reserves. They can't loan anything else out. Based on the balance sheet, calculate the required reserve. So this is usually one of the earliest questions you're going to get. So it's the same as asking, what's the reserve requirement? So we look at required reserves 2 to 10, and we find it's 20% again. Or you could say 0.2. Suppose that an individual deposits $5,000 in cash into her checking or demand deposit account. What is the immediate effect of the deposit on M1? So this is actually a very similar question as up here. But remember, in this one, and if this helps you, you can kind of draw a little picture here, right? Remember, you've got M0, demand deposits, and M1. And in this one, they take their money in M0 and they move it over to demand deposits. So the total amount of M1, again, doesn't change. What's the immediate effect of the deposit on required reserves? So this is asking, like, by how much do they change? Not just like, do they go up or do they go down, but like, how much do they change? And we know that if this person deposits $5,000 into their checking account, they have to hold 20% of that. And so the required reserves would increase by $1,000. How much of the cash deposit could the Bank of Clayton loan out? And that's asking how much is in excess reserves, right? So how much of that 5 could they loan out? Well, they could loan out 80%, which is $4,000. Okay, now this last part is just practice with some idea here of the required reserve ratios and then kind of the amount if there's a $1,000 deposit. So if there's a $1,000 deposit, 1% of $1,000 is $10. And again, you just kind of can move the decimal places to help you with this. And so we'd know that in excess is 990. This is 0.05, that's 5%. And so that would be 50 and 950. 10% is 100 and 900. 25% is 250, 750, and 50%, of course, is 500 and 500. All right, so hopefully this was a good little basic introduction to balance sheets. We didn't scare you off too much. In the next video, we're going to look at like why this reserve requirement actually has some very large effects when people go and withdraw and deposit money. All right, I'll see you next time.